happy to have Jack Goldstone come today to give a talk. The title here is on demographic changes and the international security environment. Professor Goldstone is an extremely distinguished professor at the Public Policy School. He's the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor of Public Policy and eminent scholar at the School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs at George Mason University. Harvard-educated undergrad and PhD, and a specialist on global and comparative history, political conflict, revolutions and social movements, political forecasting, democratization, state building, and global population trends and their consequences. And trained originally as a sociologist, I think, but as an author or editor of, I think, 15 books and many journal articles. It's extremely distinguished, and so we are scheduled for 1 hour, and we'll try to finish up by 1 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Professor Park, and thank you to everyone for coming today. My job here is to try and persuade you that we are going to be living in a different world. And for those of you who are students, it's going to be a very challenging world. In a sense, my generation had it easy, took advantage of it, wasted a lot of resources, destroyed a lot of others, left a terrible mess for you to clean up. But in a way, it's not our fault because we didn't really understand what was happening in the world. In some ways, the world is moving into areas, demographic, economic, political, that we did not anticipate and that create very complicated new challenges. My talk is focused on showing you the dimensions of those challenges. I do have some ideas about proper responses, public policy solutions, but I'll leave most of that for question and answer so we can follow your interests. Now, world population trends. Population growth is actually slowing down. There was a lot of anxiety, perhaps misplaced, perhaps simply good warning in the 1960s and 70s that the world was going to be overpopulated. In fact, the world has moved into a reasonably smooth trajectory of population slowing. We went from 3 billion to 6 billion in the 40 years from 1960 to 2000, but it's unlikely that we will continue growth at that rate. We will probably add another 3 billion by 2040, but after that, growth will slow markedly. And we know this is the case because already in countries that have about half the world's population, including China, the reproduction rate for women has fallen below the level of 2 children per woman. It's fallen below replacement. In Hong Kong, it's fallen ridiculously below, as many of you know. And in South Korea and Japan, women are on something of a marriage strike because the conditions of marriage are poor, so fertility is very low there. But even in India and Brazil, fertility has fallen to 2.1 or below. So overall, population growth is slowing down, probably will not stabilize this century. Latest predictions are that global population growth will continue all the way to 2100, but it will probably stabilize somewhere around 10 billion by the end of this century. However, local growth is still strong in some places, in Africa, northern parts of India, Pakistan, and the Middle East. In fact, there are 5 population groups that are growing very fast, much faster than the world population. And this is what I call the new population bomb. It's not a matter of total population growing too fast. It's not a matter of total population even exceeding resources. I think planet Earth is not as fragile as people think. When I was at Northwestern, I bought a house with 1.5 acres of land in southern Wisconsin, and I found that nature is tough. You know, you try and grow a garden, you'll get 40 kinds of weeds if you don't care for it. You try and grow trees, they'll be infested with fungi and bugs and so on. Nature is very tough and resilient. It may not be the world we want to live in. That will take some work. But I don't think the planet is threatened by overpopulation in the way some people do. I think the stability and desirability of our climate, the ability to grow the crops that will give us the diet we want, and particularly the ability to extract a level of energy that will lead to a growing standard of living, that is a great challenge. But total population growth is not, for me, the real boogeyman. What I'm concerned about, and what I think policymakers in the future will be concerned about, are these 5 population groups that are continuing to grow extremely fast. First is the population of Sub Saharan Africa. Northern Africa is growing strongly as well, but it's tapering off. Fertility decline has set in there for the most part. But in Sub Saharan Africa, fertility is still at about the level of 5 children per woman. And that is something that people thought was going to go away. Why did they think that? Well, almost every place in the world where economic growth began, fertility fell very rapidly. And in Africa, fertility fell from about 7 children per woman to about 5 fairly quickly, from the 1960s to the late 80s. And people thought it would still go on declining, but it has not. It's something of a surprise. Demographers are still debating about this. I have a paper that I'm working on this as well. I'll talk about it a little more later. But Africa's fertility remains so high that it's now projected to grow to perhaps as high as 4 billion people by the end of this century. So that's going to be huge. That'll be about 40% of global population in an area that has historically been quite underpopulated and was not a big player in the global economy. So this is one big one. The second is global middle class. Large numbers of people are being lifted out of poverty. China's a leader in this. India is also substantial. Latin America, the Middle East, even Africa now has perhaps 200, 300 million people, depending on how you count it, who are joining the consuming society. So even though global population may only grow from about 7 billion today to 10 billion eventually, a 50% increase, during that same time, the global middle class may grow by 250 or 300%. And that means many more high-intensity consumers of energy, consumers of meat products, consumers of fabricated materials. That's going to place a big strain on our productive capacity. Population of cities is growing much faster than the population overall, particularly in developing and low-income countries. Now, this is something new in history. For most of humanity's existence, only a minority of people have been privileged to live in cities, and it's been a minority that has usually been at the economic leading edge for the world. That is, the richest empires, the most advanced societies were the most urbanized. That's going to be true in percentage terms because you're looking at 85 to 90% urbanization in the rich countries. But countries that are very low in income are already at 30 to 50%. In the Middle East, some of them are 70%. Iraq is almost 80% urbanized. And so we're going to see very large cities, large urban concentrations in countries at much lower income levels than arose in the West. The world's Muslim population is growing very rapidly, which would not be worthy of remark. The world's Protestant population is actually growing even more rapidly. But what we've seen in the last 20 years, partly as a problem of United States foreign policy, partly as an issue, a legacy of colonialism, partly as a residue of stagnant authoritarian regimes. There are a lot of reasons we can argue about this. It's a complex phenomenon, but we're seeing a global trend toward an aggressive jihadist interpretation of Islam that is a recurrence of something that's happened at other times in Islamic history. There's a history of outbursts of Mahdiism, millennialism, aggressive expansionism, and we're seeing another such expansive wave at the moment. It reaches, we've seen it everywhere from the Philippines to Nigeria, Somalia, all across the Mideast now. What's perhaps a bit disturbing, as I'll show you later, is the Muslim population that is potentially affected by this global wave of more aggressive Islam is growing much more rapidly than the global population as a whole. Finally, the population of elderly is exploding. It's unbelievable. I mean, if you're a marketing whiz and you want to find the fastest growing market in the world, it's people over age 60. It's the gold mine of the future if you can figure out what they want and what they'll buy, because in much of the world they're also going to be the most prosperous segment of the population. But we've never, in the entire history of humanity, we've never lived in a world where, say, 40 to 50% of the entire adult population is over age 60. We don't know what that's going to be like. Now, fortunately, people are healthier than they used to be at age 60. 60 is the new 40. But as one of my friends who's an expert in aging says, but we don't know if 80 is going to be the new 60. We still find that as people age from 60 to 80, even though their life expectancy has increased, the incidence of disabilities, hearing loss, vision loss, arthritis, that has not changed in the last 30 years. There was a recent UN report on medical aspects of aging and found that, surprisingly, those things are not changing. We have better therapies to deal with them, so you can get artificial hips and knee replacements. But as more and more people live to the age where they need assistance, medication, systemic issues, it may be more expensive. We don't have a cure for Alzheimer's yet. It still afflicts about 1 out of every 4 people over age 80, which is not a huge problem if you have 5% of your population over age 80. But when 20% of your population is over age 80, it will start to become an issue. And we're going to have a situation where people who are in their 60s are taking care of parents in their 80s and 90s. We may have people who are in their 80s taking care of parents in their 100s because life expectancy is still growing. We've not seen a slowdown. Life expectancy is still growing by about 1 year every decade. And that's liable to continue. I mean, it used to be remarkable if someone lived to 100, right? It used to get mentioned on TV when I was a kid. But now there's so many people who reach 100, it's not even a big deal. 110 is what we're looking for. So 110 is the new 100. But we'll see how that goes in terms of health and pension spending. So here's the issue on population. As you can see, now these are absolute numbers. Some of these maps, you'll start with an index, everybody at the same, but this is actually millions here. So this says 5,000. So this is 500 million people. This is 1 billion people. This is 2.5 billion people. This total population is set to grow and grow and grow. These are somewhat conservative estimates. They're more extreme estimates for Sub Saharan Africa that place this well above 3 billion by the end of the century. But I'm trying to keep it reasonable because I don't think those are reasonable projections. But as you can see, Sub Saharan Africa is the only part of the world that's still growing without visible limit. This is China. And people, I think, still have not yet absorbed what the projections are that are locked in. Cameron here can tell you all about this. But it's quite astonishing. This is actually, I should say, this is not total population. I think these figures are working age population because they're too small for total. So this should be the population age 15 to 59. My apologies for the mislabeling. But this working age population in China started to decline already. 2010 was about the peak, 2010. And this is just astonishing. I don't think there's been a society in history that in a time of peace and prosperity has experienced this kind of population decline. But it seems almost locked in China because the cohorts of young women who were affected by the one-child policy are so much smaller than the cohorts that were raised during the Maoist pro-natal years that it's inevitable that population is simply going to decline because the number of fertile women is bound to decline. So you're looking at a decline in the working age population from about 900 million to about 550 million in the next 60 years. So almost a third of the working age population will be diminished. Latin America will grow slowly and then decline. Europe is already in decline. US will grow, but so slowly it hardly matters. If anything's remarkable about the United States, it's that it's not joining Europe, China, and Latin America in decline. However, this presumes continued strong migration to the United States because natural birth isn't sufficient, and I don't know if that's going to continue. The migration policies in the United States are somewhat constrictive, and the flow of migrants from Mexico to the United States, which was our biggest source of immigrants, has almost stopped because birth rates have fallen in Mexico, the Mexican economy is growing, the difficulties of crossing into the US increase. So most of the southern migrants coming into the United States now are coming from Central America, more troubled countries like Guatemala and Honduras, where people are moving into Mexico across the border, or coming from Colombia, or coming from Africa or the Middle East. So I don't know if this will actually happen. It may be a little more level. But obviously, we're moving into a world where growth of sub-Saharan Africa is going to dominate global population growth. The numbers can be a little startling. Nigeria today, as estimated, and it is an estimate, to have 158 million people, Uganda 33 million, Niger 15 million, China, as I said, this is the working age population. I see that I got this right here. Just under 1 billion in 2010. Well, in China, as you can see, it's going to drop very quickly. But the numbers that I have here are the medium fertility projection, high fertility projection, and constant fertility projections. And you may notice that constant is the largest number in this series because these are the United Nations projections, and for the UN, they assume that even at a high estimate, fertility will decline from today's levels. If you assume constant fertility, that is, if you assume continued 5 children per woman, you get numbers that are frankly absurd, such as over 2.5 billion people in Nigeria by the end of the century. That's inconceivable. Even 1 billion in Nigeria, which is the high end, is hard to believe. So let's look at their low-end projections. Well, still, the low-end projection, by 2050, there's not a huge difference between the medium and high projections, because in the next 40 years, a lot of this increase is already locked in. It's locked in the high level of fertility and the large number of children. More than half the population is under 15. So even if fertility drops to 4 children in the next generation and 3 after that, you're still growing and growing and growing. So you're looking at 400 million people as a reasonable low estimate for the population of Nigeria, and this is 35 years from now. Now, where are they all going to live? Are they going to live in 30 cities of 10 million plus 90 million rural? Are there going to be 200 million struggling in the countryside? Are they going to leave? Very difficult to know, but these numbers are very similar to what you get elsewhere. Uganda is projected, I mean, this is just not a tripling, this is 2.5, but Uganda is projected very likely to pretty much triple. And Niger, which has the highest fertility in the world today at 7 children per woman, even if it drops to 5, which would be a big change over the next 20 years, it's a very poor, arid country. It's looking at a huge increase in population. So these numbers are, at the very least, startling. They're being sustained because this is what's happened to total fertility in these African countries. As you can see, if you looked only from 1990 to 1994, you'd say, hey, things are going down, down, down. But somewhere around the mid-90s, fertility stopped falling. And these are all somewhat different countries. Nigeria is West Africa, Kenya is East Africa, Tanzania is Southeast, Zambia is Central. But we see the same trend all across sub-Saharan Africa. Fertility decline has halted. The result of that is the UN has had to change its projections. As recently as 2000, the forecast, this is for Malawi, but this could be any of the sub-Saharan African countries, the forecast was that population would grow substantially, but the rates would be a doubling over 2 generations. Now, they've had to adjust the estimate, this is the most recent estimate, up to a 4-fold increase since 2000. And this is just a trajectory of constant fertility this is a little slightly declining fertility, but assuming we haven't seen much change in fertility, if we don't see any change in fertility here, this is where we're headed. Now, I talk to the people at the United Nations, and they say, these are not forecasts, these are projections, which means if nothing changes, this is what you get. They are desperately hoping that the reality will be different and that public policy will somehow promote a resumption of progress in the fertility transition in Africa. Why are they hoping? Because although we're seeing a growth of GDP in Africa, we're not seeing much progress in agriculture. Most of the growth in GDP is coming out of government spending in urban areas and commodity productions. So as you can see in Kenya and Uganda, the value added in agriculture has hardly grown for the last 30 years. And this is worrisome if population growth is going to continue. Food consumption has also stagnated in much of sub-Saharan Africa. For comparison, you can see the progress that was made in the 70s and 80s in North Africa, where there were big increases in calorie consumption. A lot of this is also improvements in the quality of diet, although since 1990, you can see a stagnation, which was part of the reasons for growing discontent that led to the Arab Spring. But in Africa, things have remained, they haven't even gotten as good as in North Africa. So it's quite worrisome, as I say, especially since people have been looking at the last 10 years and promoting it as Africa rising. Per capita GDP, you can say, wow, you know, look at Uganda. This is from 1980. If you're just looking here, or you're looking at Kenya in the last 10 years, you say, great, you're on a huge upward trajectory. But we've been there before, right? And Uganda is kind of catching up from a long period of civil war and disruption. So in much of Africa, there are definite positive signs in the last 20 years, but in long-term historical context, they don't necessarily portend that they're out of the woods. Now, let's move on to the global middle class, part of which is in Africa, but much of which is elsewhere. The growth in the global middle class will occur entirely outside of North America and Europe, for that matter, pretty much outside of Japan, outside of prosperous East Asia, because those countries are already pretty much middle class. But in the rest of the world, we may see a growth. This is a McKinsey estimate. Now, this is somewhat optimistic. It was made before the Great Recession. So I now no longer expect that the global middle class will go from 2 billion to 5 billion by 2030. But even if it goes to 4 billion, it's still a very big change in a short time. You're talking about a total population in the world increase of maybe 1.5 billion in this period, but 2 billion or more moving from very low income to beginning of middle class. And beginning of middle class means people are buying appliances, using air conditioning, using cars to get around, doing some flying and travel. They become big increases in per capita energy. Also, many cases, big increases in diet. I think 3/4 of the world's hogs now live in China because of the huge increase in pork production. So it's a lot of lifestyle changes. Now, a lot of people just celebrate and say, that's great. The world will be middle class. Middle class people are good, law-abiding, democratic, should be terrific, right? But in fact, we find that education can often produce radicalism and extremism. If we look at North Africa in the last 20 years, big increase in middle class, huge increase in the number of university students. But a lot of university students get radicalized in the process, particularly if they face social mobility and employment problems after graduation. In fact, one of the strange things about North Africa is unemployment rate for college graduates was higher than the unemployment rate for high school graduates because they had higher aspirations, the economies were not yet white-collar enough to provide, and the result was a lot of political radicalism. Middle classes also tend to reinforce nationalism and ethnic and religious cleavages. A lot of people think, oh, education is liberating. Well, it can be, but education can also provide a deeper literate understanding of national history, lead to the growth of romanticism, the growth of broader identification. The people who were bought into nationalism in Europe that plunged the world into World War I and World War II were educated middle-class people. But they found the idea of a national identity even stronger and more powerful than their various local sectarian identities. And the growth of this nationalism and the clash of nationalisms is dangerous. You only have to look at the South China Sea today and say, has the rich, increasing wealth of China created a more pacifist group or a more nationalist group? Well, you know the answer to that. Nationalism has grown as or more rapidly than income in China, and this is happening everywhere. Now, middle-class status also boosts aspirations for migration. People want to move off the farm. So urban populations start swelling, and people with middle-class education have the knowledge and often the resources to cross international borders. As Mexico got richer from the 1980s to 2000, migration to the United States didn't decline, it exploded. And as the middle class grows in the Middle East and India and China, I expect to see the impetus for international migration to grow. And in Africa especially, with billions of young people, as they get richer and have a more cosmopolitan outlook, I expect the flow of out-migrants to grow as well. Of course, the market for smuggling, drugs, and trafficking increases with more consumers. Not all middle-class consumption. is law-abiding and positive, and particularly in areas, if you look at cities like Karachi or Lagos, you have a huge flourishing underground and international criminal activity, finds these kind of very large but poorly governed middle-class cities to be attractive. And as I've mentioned, the demand for meat and energy increases very rapidly with the growth of the middle class. Now, as I told people about the Muslim population in the world, I said the West needs to find a way to get along with the world's Muslim population, because they're growing much faster than we are. And if we were on hostile terms with the world's Muslim population, it's not good. There are going to be 1 billion more of them in 40 years than there are today, and there are not going to be many more of us. That is, the population of US and Europe combined will increase by maybe 5% in the next 40 years. That's the blue column here. But this is just the 25 countries who have the largest projected gains in their Muslim population. So this includes Muslims in India, as well as in Pakistan, in Nigeria, even though Nigeria is only about 50% Muslim. But the Muslim population is growing much faster than the Christian population in Nigeria. So you're likely to see from about 1.5 billion here to maybe about 2.2 billion here. So about 600 million more in just these countries alone. And globally, perhaps as many as 1 billion total increase in population in Muslims around the world, partly also because of conversions as well as natural growth. So the issue that we have of conflict, this virtual war of civilizations that seems to be growing worse day by day, is something that I would argue needs to be dealt with seriously and changed from hostility to cooperation, because otherwise the situation will truly get worse as we have 1 billion more young people potentially joining these radical movements. This problem of young people growing up in difficult places is in fact a bigger problem than just the Muslim world. My colleagues and I at George Mason University have worked on the problem of state fragility. We assess governments with their ability to provide rule of law, physical security, economic growth, and public services. And we've been able to rate the state fragility of countries from serious and high to low or medium. Now, around 2010, if you looked at the global labor force, that is the working age population, almost 3 billion of that working age population was in countries that had reasonably good governance. That is, they provided public services, rule of law, rates of homicide were moderate, human rights violations were moderate. Only about 1.5 billion, you say only, but 1.5 billion people were in countries where governance was poor. China's in here, in case you're wondering. India's in here. Also much of Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of South Asia. But these are generally the countries that also have the fastest population growth. So if we simply scroll forward 30 years, if nothing changes, there'll be 2.5 billion out of the world's labor force living in countries with fragility or ineffective governments, and still a small increase in the countries that are stable. Almost all of the increase in global labor force will be in countries where governments are having a hard time providing education, access to capital, and physical security. This is a problem for the quality of the global labor force in the future. You might say that, well, we don't have to worry about that. China's got plenty of labor force at our disposal, but that's not true. If you look back at this earlier curve, and pardon me for going back so far, but it's important, this is the growth of China's labor force in the future. It's not going to meet the needs for even keeping China's labor force anywhere near it was. This is the global labor force of the future. That's where the growth is. And if that labor force is not productive and educated, the quality of the global labor force as a whole will decline. Now, here's an interesting contrast. What is the growth of the labor force going to be in the world's largest economies? From 1950 to 2000, there's a general pattern of growth. Yes, the growth was slow in Japan, slower here in Europe. But for most countries in the world, especially China, from 1950 to 2000, they're all on a similar growth trajectory. The changes start to occur here in the 1990s, where you see this break. China growth slows down a bit, South Korea's growth. But really here, where we are today, there's a very sharp bifurcation. The richer, fast-growing economies start to have a substantial decline after 2010. As I say, in China, South Korea, it gets quite sharp. The US continues to grow, but at a much slower rate than it did from 1950 to 2000. Japan, Europe, they're all down here. These countries, which I call the TIMBY countries, Turkey, India, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, these are the countries where the labor force is going to continue to grow for the next 20 years. It'll then start to taper off and decline. But for the next 20 years, these emerging markets, that's why I'm giving the talk in this session, I assume, these emerging markets have the potential for a real demographic dividend. They have youth cohorts that, if educated and given access to capital, can power the global economy despite the declines in China and Europe. But there's a real gamble there. We have seen growth in the emerging markets slow dramatically in the last couple of years. In Brazil, growth has slowed to a crawl or reversed. In Turkey, because of a heavy capital imbalance, growth is under threat. India slowed down. China, as you know, slowed down. So this impression that people had is we don't have to worry about the future of the global economy. Emerging markets will carry us. It's not clear that that's the case. There's a lot of interrelation here. The growth of many of the emerging markets depended on China's growth. China's growth essentially depended on being able to draw large amounts of capital and ship exports to the industrialized Europe and America for a while. Then it depended on using China's capital for a heavy investment growth-led strategy. That's going to change. When China moves to a consumption-led growth strategy, how will that affect the emerging markets that have mainly been commodity producers rather than competitive producers of manufactured goods? I think this is one of the great puzzles for the future of the world economy. It's going to become more multipolar. It's going to continue to grow globalized. But what will be the sources of strength and particularly the motors of innovation and growth in a world where population growth is reversing for the first time in history since the Great Plague, really, in the rich countries, and in which the labor force growth is still lagging in educational quality and capital. Now here's some pictures just for the contrast, right? Here's an age pyramid for Germany. As you can see, this huge cohort of people in their 50s now fueling labor force and economic growth. They're going to move into their 60s. Look how small the cohorts are behind. And this is a typical picture. You could use it similarly for Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong. People just decided they'd rather have BMWs rather than children for their second garage. So this is what you get. Now here's Ethiopia, typical of African countries, very large youth cohorts. Now, there's no problem here if you just had everyone in Ethiopia move to Germany. It would all balance out. If you take the world's population as a whole and look at the age structure, it's very similar to the age structure of the United States in the 1960s, which was a very good foundation for growth, educational expansion, automation. Problem is nobody wants the population of Ethiopia to move to Germany. In fact, Europe is having a terrible issue with immigration, trying to decide they want more immigrants, but they don't want the kind of immigrants they're likely to get. You know, everybody wants immigrants provided they are some prototype of the ideal engineer who speaks the language and so on. Everyone in the world is competing for the same small group of highly skilled, talented migrants and trying to keep out the huge pool of young people who just want a better job and a better life. And I think the key to success for countries now is going to be investing overseas to improve the quality of labor force, to make it possible for migration to move more smoothly, to balance these very imbalanced age structures, which actually represent very imbalanced markets. Now, last thing I want to comment on is the aging problem. You could almost call it the aging paradox. What we're seeing, it's a good thing. Life expectancy has increased. Health has increased. Women have control over their fertility. They are voluntarily choosing to spend more time in schools, more time in the workforce, less time raising children. But the social consequences of those individual decisions is a huge change in the age structure of the developed countries. Now, Japan is today by far the oldest country in terms of average age in the world. If you go to Japan, however, you see a lot of old people, but you don't have a sense of an aging society because the major metropolitan areas are still growing, and the cohort in their 50s and 60s are still employed, productive, well-paid. They have small families, so they can take care of their children, and the young people are living at home and spending like crazy because they have disposable income. They figure they don't have to save for a house, they're going to get it from their parents. Many are living at home. But it's not a society in which you see a lot of hope or optimism for the future. Today, other Asian societies are much less aged than Japan, but they are on a trajectory for pretty rapid catch-up. China, it's going to age as rapidly, but starts from a lower base. It won't be quite as old as Japan, but here, by 2060, you're still looking at over a third of the total adult population 65 and over. In Japan, it's going to be almost 50%. Now, we don't know what societies will be like. What we do know is that today's fiscal structure, health structure, pension structure, transportation, education, almost all the social infrastructure that we've created in advanced societies was designed for societies where the majority of the population is under 45, where the youth cohorts are larger than the elderly cohorts. This is true not only for the pay-as-you-go pensions, companies that have recruited young people, and I'm talking to about some of these issues, they could basically, up until 2000, if you were a Fortune 500 company, you could say, well, every year there's going to be a new cohort of bright young people coming out of universities like Hong Kong University of Science and Technology or UCLA or Princeton. There were going to be more every year, and they were going to be more skilled than before. And so you didn't worry. Your worry was how do you compete for the best talent, not where's the talent going to come from. But that's drying up. In most of these countries, the age 10 to 24 cohort is now substantially smaller than the age 40 to 55 cohort that they're going to have to replace in the labor force. And this is the first time in American history that the skill and education level of the young cohort is no greater than that of the generation ahead of them. That is, the college percentage and skill level of 40-year-olds in America is as high as those of 20-year-olds, partly because our education system is poor and we've let it deteriorate. But it's also because a lot of the easy gains in human capital growth have been made, right? I mean, once you get to 30–40% of your workforce getting college educated, where do you go from there? Does it make sense to have an 80% college educated workforce? It doesn't correspond to the job profile anywhere. So where do you go? And what do you do with a population in which half your adults or a third of your adults are over 65? Do you try and keep them in the workforce? Well, if so, what kind of jobs? They can't all do white-collar jobs. You have a lot of work that is construction, fire, police, that's arduous. Do you automate it all? If you automate it all, what happens to the income distribution? So this aging issue is a problem. It's also a huge political problem. Why? Because the elderly vote. They have political clout. So imagine you're a farmer and you're looking at the future and you say, okay, I've got kids to feed and I've also got to keep seed corn from next year's crops, but we just had 3 years of harvest failure. What do I do? Well, the world has had a global recession from 2008 to at least 2012, in some places still going on. So what do we do? Well, logically, you should say, we have to invest in the future. We have to invest in innovation. We have to push up future productivity. But what we're actually doing is protecting the jobs and pensions of the elderly and not increasing investment in the young. It's the equivalent of a farmer saying, well, we've had a few bad years. I don't want to go hungry. So I'm going to eat, let my kids fend for themselves, and as far as seed corn for the future, they'll have to find it somewhere else. It's an absurd policy, yet it's the policy that all the rich countries are following. Japan is trying to change course. That's because they're so far along with this. They realize they're in big trouble. 200% of GDP debt, and they're going into a high aging period. They all of a sudden panicked and decided they had to do something. So they're trying to raise value-added taxes and make other adjustments. But much of the world hasn't even faced up to this issue of generational conflict and what will it take to pry resources out of the hands of an aging generation. Because I've had some people tell me with a straight face, and I'll be interested actually in seeing what Albert says about this. I've had some people tell me, look, the dependency ratio is not going to change. It's not a big deal. In the past, society's had a lot of kids. In the future, they'll have a lot of old people. But the dependency ratio overall is not a big change. To which I reply, OK, but you know, for every dollar that you invest in feeding, clothing, and educating a young person, you get an adult worker with a 40-year workforce expectancy who will contribute to the economy. So you're investing in young dependency, right? Let's say you invest that money in an old person. You give them comfortable retirement with a lot of leisure. You give them cataract and knee replacements. What happens 10 years after that? When you bury them, you bury all those investments with them. Those are literally sunk costs. So that type of dependency ratio is a whole different ball of wax in terms of investment and future than a dependency ratio with a high young population. So yes, there are certain equations in which it may seem it's not a problem, but I think if you view the social system as a whole and say, how do we reproduce the vitality and the innovation of a social system over time with this level of aging, it's really a challenge we haven't begun to face. So I think, oops, I thought I had another slide here, but there we go, okay. So what are the consequences for policy? First, Africa will be at the center of global concerns in a way that it has never been, for many reasons. Growth of the global labor force, Africa. Growth of consumption markets, Africa. Fragile states and violence, given the low quality of government and the rapid growth, the young cohorts, very likely a lot more fragility and violence. And international migration. We haven't begun to see what I think will be the large demand for international migration out of Africa. I think cities will be at the new technology frontier. How do we provide energy, food, adequate waste treatment, and transportation for cities that will be at lower incomes than the cities we're used to dealing with? A lot of these demonstration cities, ecological green cities, are very capital intensive. They make sense for cities like maybe even Shanghai, Los Angeles, Oklahoma City. But when you're dealing with cities in developing countries like Dhaka or Lagos, it's a whole different situation. How do you provide the technology to make clean, efficient, comfortable cities with very high density at low levels of income? How do you avoid the slums, urban gangs, decay that you see in the slum areas? China, Europe, and East Asia will all need to adapt to rapid aging. It's a social problem, an economic, a biological problem. How do you keep the bodies of aging people from being wheelchair-bound, nursing home dependent and keep them active? We don't know yet. It's a whole new frontier in human genomics and aging. It's a military problem too, because if you have a jihadist state in the Middle East, Europe doesn't want to send troops. America doesn't want to send troops. We don't have large numbers of young kids. They're very expensive. The future military forces are coming out of places like India, China, Pakistan. Pakistan is the largest contributor to United Nations global peacekeeping forces. But is Pakistan a country that carries a standard of police professionalism, human rights, and efficiency that you want to spread to the world? Not everyone would agree. Finally, the productivity crisis. Again, people have said Larry Summers suggested secular stagnation. I think it's more than just a secular stagnation. I think it's a real productivity crisis. We see the impact of computers only in one area, and that's the productivity of producing more computers. We can produce more bits and more bytes of memory at lower cost than ever before. But if you look at productivity per worker in the advanced economies, you see no trace of the computer innovation in that. Now maybe it's just around the corner. People keep promising that just like steam power or electricity, 10 or 20 years when we get the hang of how to use computers to amplify personal productivity, we'll see it. But right now, what we're seeing is automation replaces a lot of routine jobs. We don't see automation making skilled workers far more productive. It's not like you take a hand spinner, put them in a cotton factory, and their output goes up 100 times. I'm a professor. I now have huge amounts of computing power. I can do things that I couldn't do before in terms of data crunching. But if I want to write a paper for a professional journal, I actually have to do more work myself because I don't have a secretary. I do have a word processor It's more efficient than a typewriter, but I probably got more work done when I had a secretarial staff. But no one will give that to most professors anymore because they say with technology you can do it yourself. It's kind of like when you go to the supermarket and you have to check out your own groceries. Do you really feel that you are more productive and efficient for doing that? In some ways you are. The industry is leveraging you to do work that they used to have to pay people to do. But it's a productivity that doesn't so much amplify workers as saves money for industry and therefore amplifies the inequality in the world. How we get innovation that produces high efficiencies with good jobs for low incomes, that's a new frontier for world growth. So let me leave it there. I hope I haven't upset you too much. There are new challenges, but I believe with innovation and attention to the challenges, we can get ahead. What I think will be fatal is if we bury our heads in the sand, pretend that incremental growth will continue to save us, and that we can live in the world as if nothing fundamental has changed in the last 50 years. We're in a whole different world, demographically, geopolitically, and I think we need to start adjusting to that.
We have some time for questions. Jerry?
I think you must have more to say about the environmental problems facing Africa in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Not only for the African population facing climate change and that type of stuff,
right,
but also for the rest of the world that are start to believe that Africa is going to be their breadbasket to human rights.
Yeah. Climate is a very tricky issue because the climate change, one is, what are we looking at? Are we looking at increases in rainfall in tropical Africa? Probably, because that's where a lot of the world's moisture is going to end up, is over the tropical belt. Are we looking at increased droughts? Probably increased droughts also, because the monsoons will likely be disrupted. So you're probably looking at more flooding in the wet parts of Africa and worse droughts in the dry parts. Unfortunately, many of the countries least equipped to deal with climate change are ones that are going to bear the brunt of it. Rising sea levels, that will be a problem in some parts, but not for, I mean, most of the problem in Africa is not going to be rising sea levels. In terms of money, that's a bigger problem for countries with much more developed seacoasts. So for Manhattan, the cost of dealing with rising sea levels is huge, but they probably have the money and technology to deal with that one way or another. But in Africa, they probably don't have the resources to cope with even a small increase in droughts. Now, what will the consequences be? If Africa is able to boost its manufacturing and income so that they can purchase necessary food from abroad, they'll probably be okay even if local agricultural productivity is hurt. The thing about Africa is that the potential for increasing agricultural output is still really remarkable. There's a huge amount of land that is not irrigated that could benefit from irrigation. There's a huge amount of land that is barely cultivated because it's distant from markets and doesn't have a transportation network. There are large amounts of land that are affected by various kinds of tropical diseases that, if they were controlled, could be made more productive and could be more densely settled. So Africa, definitely, if things remain as they are, would be damaged terribly by climate change. If, however, Africa starts to reduce its fertility, improve its capital accounts, and raise output, it could cope. My concern is that you're going to have poor people in Africa competing for the same global grain surplus as a growing middle class in China and the cities of India, and so there'll be a real price pinch on global grain supplies. And of course, if people want to improve their meat consumption and their ethanol consumption, you'll be wasting edible grains on non-edible issues. So I think the real issue for Africa and climate change, is it going to be a problem? Yes. Is it going to be a crisis? That really depends on distributional issues. Do we have any kind of world governance that will manage to be rapid response for local climatic crises? Will we be able to deal with climate refugees? Right now, we've got about 40 million people that are displaced internally or internationally around the world. If that increases by half, can we cope with it? 20 million people additional as refugees is not a huge issue in a world of 6 billion people if we can provide for them. But if there's no international agency with the resources to deal with it, then it's a massive humanitarian disaster. The answer to a lot of these problems really relies on improving the quality of global governance and local governance. I think if we can do that, we can respond to these problems in a way that won't cause mass catastrophe. But if we fail to improve the quality of governance, even a small climate change can be a disaster. I'll give you one last optimistic comment. People used to point to Bangladesh as the world's basket case. They say it's poor, it's low-lying, it's vulnerable to cyclones, it's going to be terrible. But Bangladesh has done pretty well in the last 20 years. They've had a government that managed to invest quite a lot in hydrology, build refuge areas above sea level. They've become a world leader in textile production. They've had good macroeconomic policy. They've had good fertility policy. They've got birth rate down below 4, headed toward 2, much better than Pakistan, which remains kind of a semi-feudal area where government deems demographic issues irrelevant. So with good local governance and taking advantage of global markets, countries can really pull themselves up. Now, I wish we could do something about climate change. 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, we have to reduce carbon. It's not going to happen. I've become a fatalist on this. Climate is going to get worse. It's going to be a terrible problem, and it's going to be a problem faster next 30 years, not the next 80 years. But we're going to have to find ways to cope with it, because I don't think anymore that we can stop it where we are today. But I'm also more optimistic than you might be that we can cope with it if we use our resources wisely and have reasonable ways of distributing from the more wealthy to the less wealthy through market mechanisms.
The ecosystems in Africa would basically be sacrificed for human use.
Sacrifice for human use sounds so awful, as if humans don't have a right to use these at all. Look, humans have been changing ecosystems since Indians burned wood in the Amazon and the American Indians diverted rivers. So long, long before industrialization, human beings, part of what we do. I mean, termites change their environment by building termite mounds and controlling it. So I don't think you sacrifice. The question is, do we use our resources in a wise and sustainable way? Or do we waste our resources in short-term consumption without planning for the future? Now, it used to be that we planned for the future because everybody had children and you worried about your kids. Now we live in a world where 1/3 of adults don't have children, where you have economists who say, as I've seen this said, why do I have to worry about posterity? What's posterity ever done for me? Let people in 50 years who are going to be richer and have more energy, let them take care of future problems. I'm going to consume today. That ethic is a bigger disaster for me than incremental declines in climate. Now, can we screw up the whole system so much and end life as we know it? Yes, it's possible, and we might do that. But I'd kill myself if I thought, that we have no future and we'll burn out. Now, we could, but I really think human beings are resourceful enough and diverse enough and varied enough, and you talk to people in Africa, they are trying to keep their ecosystem intact for the future. They just need to have the tools and support from the rest of us. We can't be irresponsible consumers here and say whatever we do has no impact elsewhere or let other people care about that. So it's a change in ethos that I think is necessary.
David and then Kelly.
You're so gracious.
Yeah, but she's my boss. So
okay.
I actually have 2 questions, but I'll have to decide which one I want to ask. But I'll follow up on the one I'll do the security one. So the talk was, sub-theme was the security environment. Could you talk more about what you see as the energy insecurity? South China Sea's easy, right? Japan, China, Vietnam, China. Right. But on a global scale, we've got the shale revolution, which seems to have lessened U.S.-China energy, but some people say shale's only good for 10 years. Right. How do you see this in the larger security? Because that was one of the sub-themes.
Sure.
Right?
I actually believe that the issue of competition for oil, South China Sea, it's all about the oil resources. I think that's overblown. I think what's happening in the South China Sea and elsewhere is a matter of fighting for national prestige and influence. The oil is a convenient excuse, put an oil drilling platform. If they didn't have an oil drilling platform, they'd build an airstrip as they're doing elsewhere. It's whatever they can do to establish a claim, right? Now, oil, I remember the discussion of peak oil when I was an undergraduate, and I remember started looking at some of the geologists who were counter to peak oil, and they said, there's a lot of carbon in the world. And there's a lot of carbon locked up in all different kinds of formations. And so the idea that we'll run out of oil, that could only be true if we're technologically limited to oil that is highly liquid, highly pressured, and easily accessed within the first 2 miles of the Earth's crust. Once you start looking in underwater resources, Arctic shelf, shale resources, there's more fossil fuel than we need. We haven't even begun to tap gas there. Even Israel found, if Israel finds oil, there must be more oil in the world, right? Oil and gas. My concern about that is make it easy. We're going to end up with another 50 years in the fossil fuel cycle that we didn't really need. If we hadn't found all this stuff, the price of fossil fuels would have gone up. We would have been pushed into solar and other alternatives a little bit faster, would have been better for the climate. Now, because it's so easy and everybody's proud that the US is going to be the world's #1 oil producer, we're looking for new ways to burn oil and gas. So I don't think that's the real problem of international security. We might have to worry about Russia in Europe. We've got to move gas to areas that Russia is controlling the gas flow to so that they're not so dependent. But the big international security issues that I see are fragile states and the breakdown of order, continued conflict between Muslim and non-Muslim regions, which has grown worse rather than better in the last 20 years. Continued conflict between growing countries, emerging market countries like Turkey and Brazil that want a bigger influential role on international organizations, and the defensive European and American who think they know better kind of role, not recognizing that their economic and demographic role is continuing. And my biggest concern is if we have in Africa a continent of 4 billion, 3 billion at maybe 4 billion at worst people 100 years from now, and if there is something like the ISIS phenomenon now in the Middle East recurs in a larger scale on Africa, as it could. Africa has big wars every 20, 30 years ago. They haven't solved the ethnic problems and so on. Where is the world going to find peacekeeping forces if the populations of the rich countries are so depleted? For me, the idea that NATO can somehow police the world is absurd. It's an anachronism. It's based on a world that doesn't exist anymore. We need a new national global governance based on integrating countries like Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, and India into the main international governance institutions. It's culturally challenging. It's politically challenging. But so was solving the aftermath of World War II. I have to remind people that at the end of World War II, Europe was in ruins. It had been under dictatorship for 20 years. It was under terrible war. It was devastated. Japan, almost every city in Japan was flattened. The world was in a deep period of distrust and uncertainty. Communism was spreading. America felt beleaguered. Technology was at a much lower level than it is today. And yet we somehow turned that into a world in the 1980s of such prosperity that we seem to take it for granted that, oh, it all comes easy. It's all natural. Global order and economic growth just flows from the market. People, I think, are not paying attention to the lesson of history. So when people say, yeah, the Middle East is a horrible mess, it'll never get to democracy, Africa's a long way, I say, remember how bad Europe was in 1947? It's possible to make positive changes, but people have to apply themselves. So the international security problems are huge. They require a new global organization. But we have to try and make it happen.
I really appreciated your talk, especially the broad sweep and the system level analysis of the various factors that you expect to see in the next several decades. One thing I especially appreciate, though, is it's really a critique of modernization theory. And there are plenty of critics of modernization theory out there, but it just won't die, right? It's still going so strong. There's still such a strong teleological sense about what economic development, industrialization, urbanization, increasing education can lead to. And what you're saying is, well, actually, if you look at it at a global level, all of these factors that modernization theory has been prescribing and that public policy, really people that with influence in public policy have been prescribing inside the Beltway and also in international organizations, is that, no, that's not necessarily a solution for a stronger, it's not necessarily a stable solution, right?
Now, I've been accused of being a big defender of modernization theory in my other work, so I'll give you a reply, but keep going.
You write very broadly, so I'm not aware of that fact. But for
this particular talk, one thing that I didn't hear articulated as directly is the implications on inequality? We often look at domestic Gini coefficients, but since your level of analysis here was really global,
right.
what are the implications for the global Gini?
Well, I'm glad you raised that. I am very concerned about rising inequality. I'm not quite sure, however, what to do about it, so I shy away a little bit from discussing it until I've given it more thought. But I'll tell you where my thinking is now. It is good and normal in the process of economic development for inequality to increase. The kind of Kuznets curve, I think, does have some validity because take a country that's poor, it can't magically get rich all at once, right? There have to be some leading edges of economic growth, and they'll pull the rest behind. So you expect that in the early stages of economic growth, the cities, the areas affected by leading industry, foreign investment, rising education will grow, and you'll have inequality. And then good government policy, just as China is doing now with regard to the inland regions, will try and redirect some growth to promote catch-up of the lagging regions. So that type of inequality, I think, of course, you're going to see that. In Africa, you're going to see some regions and countries will get richer first. The type of inequality that worries me more is the result of globalization and automation that is taking away the type of low-skilled but middle-income jobs that built the middle class in Europe and America in this century. So when people moved out of agriculture and they moved into manufacturing, they got better jobs. And it even used to be in the 30s and 40s that if you moved out of manufacturing into white-collar work, it increased your income, right? If you were an hourly worker and you got a job even as a clerk or in a store, it was usually lighter work at equal or better pay and certainly with better benefits. Well, that started to change. In the 50s and 60s, unions got a bigger share of benefit and high-paid work, and we started to see a division of the white-collar labor force into managerial and then low-income retail and service. That trend has increased, and with manufacturing becoming increasingly automated, as countries modernize or develop, they're moving straight into more services. Rather than 2/3 of the population going from agriculture to manufacturing, they go into services, but they no longer go into white-collar jobs that are high income as a rule. A small number of them go into very high-income white-collar work, but a large number go into tourism, retail, food services, low-end healthcare, and that's not, I mean, it's okay work. Working in a call center is sometimes a step up for young kids in India, but it doesn't meet the aspirations that people have for careers. They get frustrated with that, and if that's all they can look forward to, they're not satisfied. We don't yet know what is the next frontier. I mean, maybe everybody will be a video game producer, right? Maybe everybody will be a blogger, but we don't know how to get incomes out of that. Writing is disappearing as a source of income. It's not just newspapers, but even novelists. There was an article I read in the New York Times about, do you want to be a writer? Fine. However, you're not going to make money at it. Most books, will generate, the average author earns, I think it was £7,000 a year in royalties. So most people were subsidized by academic jobs or publicity jobs or corporate jobs, and they wrote on the side. But those jobs are disappearing now. They're being outsourced. Some are even being automated. And so kind of the opportunities people have for rewarding work are diminishing. And the gap between those who manage large organizations and those who work in them has been increasing. That type of inequality, I actually think, is dangerous for democracy. It's disruptive for the quality of life. It even makes it hard to get the type of consensus to overcome some of these generational conflict issues. Yeah, I mean, even in Israel, which used to be kind of a socialist paradise, they had riots in the streets, not just over the wars, because young people couldn't afford apartments anymore in Tel Aviv. And so this problem is, it's Thomas Piketty's issue. Piketty, however, has a very fatalistic approach, and this iron law that if the rate of return on capital exceeds wages, inequality will grow. I don't believe that, because I think it's not the rate of return on capital that's crucial, it's the social distribution of return. There's nothing that says we have to live in a world where returns are concentrated to the owners of capital, right? That's a Marxist world. We did get beyond that for a while. The problem is, do we have middle-class jobs that will sustain a voting majority and leaders who want to build a kind of broad coalition, Or are we moving to a world where managers of large corporations around the world who live in flats in London and Manhattan have their own view of how the world should be, maximally efficient, market-driven, maximal rewards for those who are able to rise to the top of organizations, and to heck with everybody else? And if that's the model that prevails, I don't think we're going to get the world that we grew up in. You know, it's going to be a very Blade Runner kind of world. So I hope we don't get that.
Thank you.
I think we should stop here because we're a bit over time.
I'm sorry.
So let's thank Jack for a very stimulating talk.